Well, good evening. So welcome to Deuteronomy. Let's see if this works here. Lesson number 10. This is our last one in Torah. The lawgiver addresses God's people. So where does this name of this book, Deuteronomy, come from? Just like we've seen so far, it comes from the Hebrew. In this case, the Hebrew word is dvarim. This is what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to give you some background Deuteronomy. Then we're going to talk about the division of the text. First 4 chapters are, can I move this forward a little bit? Will I still be on the, can you still see, Dave? Okay, because the pointer's not working otherwise. So chapters, I still have to do this. It's not even on the, it doesn't show up on the screen. See, I'm doing this back and forth and up and down, and it's, yeah, okay, well, that's not going to work. Okay. So we have a background to the book and the first 4 chapters. So basically, this is 3 addresses by Moses. So as you read the text, you realize there's Moses speaking to the people 3 times. The first 4 chapters is the first address. Then you have the second address. You have some laws, because what would Torah be without some laws? And then you have the third address, and then finally the death of Moses. So again, the name in Hebrew comes from Devarim, which means the words. Now, this is interesting. So again, just like with all the other books, this is the first words of the text in Hebrew. And it's in English too, the words. But here's what do they mean by the words? The words that Moses spoke, or remember the word for the 10 commandments. It's actually the Hebrew word is the 10 words, okay? And so it could be referring to the retelling of the 10 commandments, the 10 words. So either way, it's the words, okay? The Greek and the Latin, Deuternomion, in Greek, Deuteronomy is the second law. So deutero, second, nomi. Nomi is an interesting word to translate from Greek into English, but in this case, we're going to call it law. So it's the second law or the second giving of the law. It's not a new set of law, and really. There's a couple of additional things, but mostly it's a repetition of what we already heard before. So that's why it's called what it's called in Greek, which comes into Latin, which comes into English as Deuteronomy. Okay. The authorship. Well, we know that it's not written any earlier than coming into the Promised Land, because, of course, they're telling about coming into the Promised Land, so it can't be written before that. So it has to be written sometime after 1200 BC, and it's no later than the time of Christ. So because Christ refers to the book of Deuteronomy in the scriptures, so we know it's somewhere between 1200 and 0. That's all we know for a fact. What we presume is that there's quite a bit of things to narrow it down a little bit after that. There's references to structures, social structures, religious structures established by David and Solomon. A settled land, a kingship, a central sanctuary in Jerusalem. So if that's being referred to in the text, and that doesn't start to 1000, well, we've narrowed it down from 1200 to 0 to 1000 to 0, because King David lives in 1000. At first, it seems to be inseparable from the book of Numbers, but in time, it was believed to be largely composed after the return from exile in 560 BC. So we took it from 1200 to 1000 to 560. So sometime between 560 and the birth of Christ is when it's composed. Most likely before the Septuagint, which is about 100 years before Jesus. So it's somewhere between 560 and 100 is the book of Deuteronomy as we know it today. It was compiled. Okay, so it's probably the last one written. Chapter 1, verse 3 is the only specific date given. And it says, in the 11th month on the first day, 40 years after they left Egypt. So there's a date, 11/1/40, dated from the date of leaving Egypt, when Moses speaks to the people. So there's some idea of when this was. Okay? Why was it written? Perhaps to encourage support for the proper treatment of the disadvantaged, widows, the fatherless, aliens. Certainly, it's another explanation of the law. And so it's explaining to us why the law is important and how to live in the law of God. It's also written to offer encouragement in living in the covenant with God as his special people. One scholar says it's essentially the tale of one God, one people, one sanctuary, and it's the most theological book of the Old Testament for both Jews and Christians. So it's about one God, one people, one sanctuary. How does it fare in the rest of the Bible and the rest of the sacred scriptures? Chapter 4 is referenced in Acts of the Apostles, in Hebrews, and in Revelation. Chapter 21 is referenced in Matthew, Mark, and John, and other portions are referenced in other places directly and sometimes indirectly. So it's all over the New Testament. Some specific characteristics of the book. It's written as Moses' last instructions and speeches and warnings and blessings to the people on how to live in the land given to them by God. It's meant to offer hope to a discouraged Israel. Remember, when we hear Israel, in this case, we're not thinking of a nation like we think of today. We're thinking of a people, the descendants of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, a corporate person. So remember that idea that Jacob is the father of a nation. A new chance to obey the covenant and the lesson that God's punishments are not final. It stresses the divine word never fails us. In chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of, and they actually say there, Yahweh. Okay? Man does not live. We hear that. We're going to hear that in a couple weeks at Mass again. On the first Sunday of Lent. So not this weekend, but the weekend after that, we're going to hear that verse. As I said, it's divided into speeches and sections. The core of the book is chapters 12 to 26, the law code called the Second Law. Again, it's very similar to Exodus 20 to 23. So if you're reading it, you felt like you read it before, you did. Scholars have also indicated that, remember, we talked about this with in Exodus, at the end of Exodus. But the book itself seems to follow the pattern of that covenant language. Remember we talked about the parts of a covenant? There's the stating of what God has done for you. There's the statement of his expectations. There's how to promulgate this. There's the section on what happens if you keep the law and what happens if you don't keep the law. Remember we talked about that pattern, how covenants are written? It seems like this whole book is written after that same pattern. So you have a preamble in chapter 1, verse 1, you have a preamble naming the king. We have that again. In chapters 1 through 4, you have the history of the king's kindness, the way that God's shown his kindnesses in the past. In end of chapter 4, all the way through 26, including all that law section, the list of the demands of the king, the demands of God in this case. Chapter 27, the promulgation. In chapter 27, we have provisions made for the annual reading of the covenant. Remember we saw that there was no, in Exodus, we saw in the covenant at Sinai, there was no witness of God's, and because there was only one God, and he was one of the parties of the covenant. So again, you don't have in Deuteronomy that part. But then you do have the final in chapter 27 and 28, curses and blessings in keeping the covenant. So it follows that same pattern. You can see that in the text of Deuteronomy, that this covenant language, this covenant structure is very much present. We have promises and judgments and rewards and punishments. Right? If you use the land the right way, if you're obedient to God, you'll prosper. If you enter into idolatry and disobedience, you will lose your land. You will have destruction of your people. You'll be in exile. The pagans will come to power over you. So it's all laid out in Deuteronomy. Again, if Deuteronomy is written as late as some people think it is, they're telling what's going to happen if you don't keep the covenant, because it all happened because you didn't keep the covenant. So when we read Deuteronomy, we see a tension at play. In the past, we were told that people had a difficult time in relationship with God in the covenant because the people kept failing for their part. In the future, the text warns if the people are not filling the covenant, they will go forward. And then we're left with this overall tension. What will the people choose? God sets before them a choice. And what are they going to choose? And if you read the rest of the Old Testament, you'll find out what they chose. Many times in the text, Moses refers to this idea of today. We should hear today as different levels. There's the today of the 6th century BC when the text was written. There's the today of the 1200 BC when it's all happening. But there's also the today of the time of Christ and the apostles and the early Christian communities. And for us today in the 21st century, for the people we love, the people in the church, the people of goodwill, anybody who listens when God says, "Hear, O Israel." So you can read that today when Moses is talking about it today in a bunch of different levels. His time, the time of the writing, the time of Christ and early Christian communities, the time today. There's a little bit more poetic language than, say, like Leviticus, where it was all, you shall do this, you shall do this, and you should not do that. Some vivid imagery used in Moses' speeches meant to touch not only our minds, but our hearts, to encourage us to be faithful to God so that we can know his blessings. So that's just kind of an overview to the structure and the writing style of the book. There's that covenant pattern I was talking about. So there's the preamble. There's telling us what God has done, what God wants us to do, us being the people he's making covenant with. That it's supposed to be read out loud every year. This doesn't exist because there are no other gods. And then the curses and blessings. So the first address of Moses. No, that's not it. Sorry. wrong address. Had to throw a little humor in there.
I only call it Deuteronomy.
So remember, Deutero means second.
Yeah.
Nomion means law.
Okay.
So it's the second law. So it's not a second set of laws, but it's a repetition, second reading of a law. Yeah.
Okay.
What's that? Beta. Onomy 0.2. Okay, so you have this first address of Moses. Chapter 1, I'm going to go quickly through this because I really want to talk about wrapping all this up tonight too. So I'm going to try not to miss any important points, but I'm going to go a little fast. So chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1, we have introduction, the command from God to occupy the land, how the tribes are organized. God tells them to go forth, keeping with the ancient covenant. The Amorites are hill people, they encounter. The Canaanites are the coastal people, so people living along the Jordan River. I think I mentioned it last week. Along the Jordan River and along the Sea of the Mediterranean Sea, that's the Canaanites. The Amorites are the hill people. There's a remembrance of the leaders helping in governance and remembering the journey from Horeb to Kadesh, sin and punishment. Verse 37 was a neat verse. The Lord was angry with me on your account, Moses said. Punished for his own sin, or is he being punished for his own sin or for the people's sins? The actions of the people moves Moses to, does the actions of the people move Moses to sin? Does he really get tired of them and so he falls into sin, disobeying God because he's tired of them? Or is it completely on himself? So that's the literal, but I'm talking about the metaphorical behind the meaning behind all of it. So in chapter 2, the people are going through Edom, Moab, and Ammon. They're conquering Heshbon and Bashan. The Edomites, remember who the Edomites are? Those are the Esauites. Those are the descendants of Jacob's brother. And then they go through Moab and they encounter the sons of Lot. So that's the descendants of their grandfather's relatives. Chapter 3, they settle the Transjordan tribes. We talked about that last week. Remember the 3 tribes that settled on the east side of the Jordan River, and they settled first, and then they were supposed to help their brothers to settle their lands as well. Reuben and Gad do that. Verses 21 and 22, you see this handing on. That's one of the themes of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses hands on the mantle of leadership to Joshua. And then we see that God is fighting for his people. And then chapter 4, the end of this section, the end of the first address, is kind of like a prologue to what's going to come along. We're told that God is near to the Israelites, and we're recalling all the things that God has done. Verse 10, we're told to gather the people. The Greek word there is ekklesia, which is where we get the word for church. So the assembly is the assembly of God's people. There's the association of the Decalogue with the law. There's a prohibition against images as idols. This is important. This becomes a battle in the Judeo-Christian tradition to this very day. The idea of the use of images. They're not prohibiting representations. What God is prohibiting is creating idols. So if I have a picture of Father Doug on the wall up there, I know that's not Father Doug. If I treat it as if it's Father Doug himself, that's an idolatry. But if I just recognize that it's a representation of Father Doug, it's not Father Doug, that's not idolatry. Okay? For those of you who idolize Father Doug. One of the major themes of the uniqueness of the chosen people. So this is unique because the people, remember, all of this is because the people of Israel, the descendants of Israel, are unique among all the nations. They belong to God in a way that nobody else does. So this is a major theme coming up in this in the text and in Moses' speech here, reminding them that they're special, they're unique. Okay, that's the first address. The second address of Moses, chapters 5 through 11. Chapter 5, we have a continuum of the retelling of history. Why is it important to retell the history? Everybody who lived the history is dead. Remember, everybody who left Egypt is dead. So the next generations need to hear the history. There's no books to write it in at this point, so it's all oral tradition. And so it's a passing on of the retelling of what happened. Chapter 6, they're given laws for life in the land. Now, this is where you have chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Let me pull up the text here. Come on, Bible. Let's see if I get a signal. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Okay. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. So what I just sang for you is the most important verse in all of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6, chapter 4. That was on the screen every week we gathered in Hebrew. And people were like, what is that? That's the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. Hear, O Israel. I'm going to read it for you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. There's different translations, but the key is here. That's Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Is one. He's not 3, 6, 12. He's not a pantheon. He's one God. And he is unique. He is alone. He is one. So all that is, when they say Adonai Echad, Adonai, the Lord is one, all those different meanings of the word one are comprised in that word. Remember, Hebrew is a very language poor, vocabulary poor language. So they have one word that means a lot of different things. Okay? So, hear, O Israel. Continues, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might or strength. These words which I command you this day, which I enjoin on you this day, shall be written upon your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and your gates. Okay. That's verses 4 through 9. It's the most important part of the book. It's arguably the most important part of Torah, because if you don't get that first verse, verse 4, nothing else makes any sense. Why keep this guy's commandments if he's not God, or if there's other gods besides him?
Do they sing that at Sabbath?
Sometimes, yeah. But they recite it multiple times a day. Yep.
Oh, they do.
Yes, it's very, very important. Okay, so It's to be recited 3 times a day. It's the principal practice of the entire Judaism. It's a statement of monotheism. It's the greatest commandment. It goes on to remind them what happened at Meribah and Massah as the places of testing the Lord. Chapter 7, the command to destroy the Canaanites. When Israel comes to the promised land, the Lord defeats the peoples there. God commands they must destroy them, not mingle with them, not intermarry with them, not do business with them. Destroy them, get rid of them, because they're going to cause you to apostatize. And that's, God will not tolerate that. They will cause you to turn your back on me. Better for them to be gone than for them to exist and cause them to turn your backs on me. So that's why he commands it. Verse 6, he says, why? You are a people holy to the Lord. Verses 6 through 11 in chapter 7. Hold on a second. Chapter 7, verses 6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples that are on the earth. It was not because you were more in number. It's not because you were all that. But as the Lord says, love upon you, for you were the fewest. It's because the Lord loves you, and he's keeping this oath to you. Know therefore the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps his commandments, keeps his covenant with you to the 1,000th generation, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment and the statutes and the ordinances which I command you this day. So he tells you right there why he's destroying the peoples in front of him. Okay? We move on to chapter 8. Obey what I enjoin on you that you may live and multiply and have your land. Multiply and have your land. That's the covenant with Abraham. It's coming full. This is what you need to do. I promise you all along, descendants and land. I've given you the descendants. You're a nation. I'm giving you the land. I'm keeping my covenant with you. But you have to keep your part and obey what I enjoin on you. Be careful not to, Moses says, be careful not to forget what God has done, for if you do, you will die. Chapter 9, occupation is God's work. There's apostasy at Horeb. There is retold the apostasy that happened at Horeb and Sinai and how Moses interceded for the people. Chapter 10, in homiletic fashion, Moses is now preaching. He's not just like saying obey the laws, but he's really giving like a homily here. Recall what God has done for you and how the people responded. And he exhorts them, remain faithful to the Lord, keep his commandments. So he's not just saying God wants you to keep his commandments. He's saying you need to keep his commandments. I'm telling you, you need to keep his commandments. It's like he's preaching now, not just relaying words for God. And then chapter 11, continuing on the theme of fidelity to the Lord who has provided, Moses presents finally in this at the end of chapter 11, this passage we've heard in church before. Moses presents, I set before you a blessing or a curse, fidelity or apostasy, obedience or sin. It's set here before you. What are you going to decide? And so that's what Moses concludes chapter 11 with. Then we go into a whole section of laws again. 13 chapters of laws. I'm not going to go into every one of the laws because it'll take way too much time. These sets of laws, if we found a manuscript that was 3,000 years old, it would probably look a little different than ones that we have from 2,500 years ago or from 2,000 years ago. They've been edited and re-edited and re-edited. It's not just a law code because there's exhortation as well included in here. Chapter 12, remembering how the Israelites are to be a people set apart. They're commanded not to use the altars of false or local gods. Even though those are convenient and they're handy, there's altars already there. Let's just use those. We've kicked them out. No, God doesn't want them to do that. Remember God's command for worship, how God has told him he wants his worship. What happens here can be seen as a second law, repetition of the laws given. So in chapter 14, you have purity laws. Chapter 15, you have the sabbatical year. This is all review. We've heard all this before. The sabbatical year and how remission of debt. Chapter 16, keeping the religious festivals, Yom Kippur and Purim and Shabbat and all this stuff. The religious offices, what's the role of the Levites? What's the role of the priests in chapter 17? Chapter 18, more on the priests and Levites. Chapter 19, don't do what your neighbors do. You're not your neighbors. I was telling somebody yesterday, I said, I think it was at the lector workshop last night, but Tommy's mother lets him do this. How many parents have heard that? You know, well, they got to do it. How come they can do it? We can't do it. Don't do what your neighbors do. You're not your neighbors. You're special. You're unique. Chapter 20, how to engage in war. Chapters 21 and 22, a bunch of different kinds of laws, all just kind of thrown in there. Chapters 23 through 25, other laws for ritual purity and the cult. Remember, we talked about the cult multiple times, what that means. And chapter 26, law for the first fruits. And the whole section concludes. So this whole section on reiterating the law concludes with an exhortation. Keep the law. We're not just saying this because we have nothing better to talk about. Keep the law. Not only in the word of the law, but with your whole heart and soul. I'm going to read a quick passage here for you. From chapter 26. This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and ordinances. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul, not just on the surface. You have declared this day concerning the Lord that he is your God, and that you will walk in his ways and keep his statutes and his commandments and his ordinances, and will obey his voice. And the Lord has declared this day concerning you that you are a people for his own possession, as he has promised you, and that you are to keep all his commandments. That he will set you high above all nations that he has made, in praise and in fame and in honor, and that you should be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he has spoken. So keep these laws. It's part of the covenant with God. He's going to keep his part and do it not just on the surface, but with your heart and soul. Okay? The last section of the law code here, 27, 15 to 26, has the 12 curses. These are the things that happen if you don't keep the law. Chapters 28, 1 through 14 is the blessings for fidelity. So there's the curses and the blessings. It's just like Jesus does on the Sermon on the Mount. The blessed are's and the woe to's. Same thing. And then there's some warnings in the end of chapter 28. What happens if you don't keep God's law? Then you have the third address of Moses in chapters 29 and 30. Very likely, because it is style-wise and content-wise, it's a little different than the rest. There's thought that this is probably an addition being tacked on to Deuteronomy at the end of the law section later on after the exile. Because it functions more like a sermon than it does like anything else in Deuteronomy. So it's likely an exhortation to fidelity for the people coming back after the exile. Remember everything God has done for you. Keep his laws. Okay? So that's the third address. Finally, we get to chapters 31 through 34 and the death of Moses. So first, he has to commission Joshua. He has to have somebody that's going to take his place. We talked about that in Numbers last week, but it didn't happen he didn't die in Numbers. So this is kind of repeating what Numbers already told us, that Joshua is the one that takes over. It's probably added to the text afterwards because Joshua, they know what Joshua did and what Joshua said and everything. So there's an exhortation of fidelity. He calls Joshua and promises good for him, and the Lord commissions him in chapter 31, verse 23. So that's the first thing that has to happen before Moses is gone. Second thing that has to happen is what happens to Torah? What happens to the things that Moses has given him, the commandment tablets, the law on the scrolls? What happens to all this stuff now? So again, this is probably post-exilic, and they're told, keep these books and read them 7 years from now. Remember promulgation in the covenant and the covenant steps, promulgation? So this is a structured promulgation. Read this before the whole community 7 years from now. So the law books have been passed on, and they're told they're important. You have to keep them. You have to read them again. So this is the things that are happening to set us up for Moses to be separated from the people. In chapter 31, most of the verses of chapter 31, and into chapter 32, you have what's called the Song of Moses. Okay, this is Moses' hymn of praise. It's believed that this is a very late addition to the text. It's still a beautiful hymn of praise. Whether Moses wrote it and sang it himself or not is almost irrelevant. It's still a beautiful hymn. God teaches it to Moses and commands that it be sung. It could be very early Elohist, or it could be very late Deuteronomy. And it's thought it could be Deuteronomy or Deuteronomic, remember JEPD, because it's an exhortation to faithfulness, which is a big theme of Deuteronomy. Another very late addition, the blessing on the tribes. So it goes through all 12 of the tribes. There's a blessing on each individual tribe. 2 tribes are not mentioned in there. If you picked up which 2 were not in there. No Simeon and no Levi. These are no longer, Levi is no longer a secular tribe. It's a religious tribe. And so there's no blessing on that. It's handled separately. There's a Benjamin and Manasseh, the descendants of Joseph, one of the 12 sons. They're counted separately. So we talked about that last week when we talked about the map and how Benjamin and Manasseh get. So there's 12 tribes if you count Benjamin and Manasseh, because Joseph's not a tribe, so that makes it 11, and Levi's not a tribe, that makes it 10. So the additional 2 are Benjamin and Manasseh, that makes it 12. And then a repetition of this theme again. You're special among the nations, and enemies will serve you if you remain faithful to God. You are unique. You're not like everybody else. Moses is 120 years old. God reveals to him what his end is going to be. Mount Nebo in Moab, opposite of Jericho. And he gets to see Canaan, and he dies on the mountain. It's likely a revised account of Numbers 27 that we read last week, in light of the themes of arriving in the land, the punishment for sin, but being honored among the people and by the Lord. We're told that the sons of Israel wept for him for 30 days. And then we come to the last 3 verses of Torah. Not just the last 3 verses of Deuteronomy, but the last 3 verses of Torah, of the whole 5 books. The author says there is no parity between Moses and any other prophet. Moses is unique among all the prophets that ever were or ever will be. One of the reasons why is, even though it was indirect, but he knew the Lord face to face. We don't hear of anybody else being described as talking to the Lord face to face. We have that implication with Abraham, with the 3 visitors, and it's thought that the 3 visitors maybe were angels, or maybe they represented the Holy Trinity. But it's clear over and over again that Moses gets to speak to God face to face. That never happened. And then all the wonders God did through him, there's nobody else. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, nobody else has so many things that God did through him as Moses. Parting the Red Sea, the 10 plagues, on and on and on. Water from the rock, quail, manna. Nobody else has a list like that. So it makes it very clear that Moses stands out among all of those who have ever been prophets or ever would be prophets. Clearly to the very end, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but also even in Genesis with creation and establishment of family, that it's because of God's mercy and the covenant that Israel becomes a great nation, enters the promised land. It's not because the people were worthy. It's said that in the last chapters that we just saw. It's not because they were more worthy than anybody else. It's not because they were richer than anybody else, or smarter than everybody else, or better looking than everybody else, or larger than everybody else. It's because of God's mercy. There was nothing that was so unique about Noah except he participated in God's will. There was nothing so important about Abraham and his descendants except they participated in God's will, as we saw most of the time. There's nothing so special about Moses and the Israelites coming out of Egypt except God extended himself to them. He heard their cries for mercy. Those same people said, why did you make us leave? He heard their cries for mercy and extended mercy to them. Out of his generosity, he extended covenant. Before I turn you back to your discussion questions, I do want to kind of wrap up studying of Torah. First thing I want to talk about is this idea of covenant again. Covenant and contract are not the same thing. A contract says, I offer Kathy a position on staff at St. Elizabeth Seton Parish. She offers me work, I offer her a wage. I'm sure it's not enough, but it's not what she deserves, I'll say that. That's a contract. I give you something, you give me something. Okay? We had a contract of sorts, an unspoken one, that you were going to come, you were going to do the homework, you would have the discussion, and I would tell you some things about Torah. Okay? I give you something, you give me something. Okay? That's a contract. That's not a covenant. A covenant says, I give you my total self, and you give me your total self. It's much more profound. It's like marriage. Okay? I give my total self to you, and I receive your total self. You give me your total self, and I receive that. It's that total exchange of self. What we've seen in Torah is not a contract. It's a covenant. Whether it was with Noah or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or whether it's at the foot of Sinai, it was always God saying, I give you everything I have to offer you. I want you to give me your whole self. That's why it's a covenant and not just a contract. So this idea of covenant is very important. Last night we were talking to the lectors about the readings. Sneak preview that the lectors heard last night. For the first 5 weeks of Lent this year, the first reading every week, cycle B reading. So those of you who are going to be 11 o'clock Mass on the 3rd, 4th, 5th Sundays, you're going to get a different set of readings. But if you're at 5 and 8:30 for all 5 weeks, or even 11 o'clock on the 1st and 2nd Sunday of Lent, you're going to be hearing about covenant over and over and over again. The first week, it was the covenant with Noah. The second week, it's the covenant with Abraham. The third week was the covenant at Sinai. The fourth week is Jeremiah promising a new covenant. You're going to hear covenant over and over and over again in the readings this Lent coming up. And that's done on purpose. That's not accidental. That's the church setting us up. Look at all these covenants that God offered and how people responded to them. And then Jeremiah tells us there's going to be a new one. What's the new one? It's the covenant in Christ Jesus. So the church is taking us through all this that you've studied the beginnings of, Noah and Abraham and Sinai. And it's going to be setting up to remember those as we enter into the Triduum and we see the establishment of the new and forever covenant. So this is really important for us as Christians. We're going to see on Holy Thursday at Mass that Christ gives us the new covenant. As he says, the new covenant in my blood. On Good Friday, we're going to see that that's fulfilled on God's part and man's part in Jesus dying. God establishes that new covenant in the death of Jesus on the cross. And Jesus, who is fully God and fully human, on behalf of humans, enters into that covenant on our behalf. It invites us to follow him into that covenant. And then on Easter, we're going to see glorified and open to us when we hear that good news that Christ is risen from the dead and lives in eternity, that covenant has been promised and fulfilled. So we're being set up in Lent. So pay attention to that in these readings, the Old Testament readings for these weeks of Lent coming up, that we're going to be hearing the covenant. And you've been studying about covenant for the last 10 weeks now, a little break in between. So don't let go of that idea of covenant. Bring that with you to Mass, because you're going to hear about that. And it's going to make the experience of Lent and Easter a little more profound, because you're going to understand more about what's going on with the covenant. The other thing I want to mention was, for 10 weeks, we've heard a lot a lot about sacrifices. I mean, a lot. Everything from the sacrifice to God of Abel, how that was accepted, and the sacrifice of Cain was not. The sacrifice to God of Noah upon entering the covenant on dry land. The sacrifice to God of Isaac being offered by Abraham. The sacrifice to God of the Lamb on the Passover in Exodus. The sacrifice to God commanded and offered according to the law that we heard a lot about. What can be offered? How does it be offered? Who offers it? Where is it offered? We heard a lot about sacrifices in these last 10 weeks. In these sacrifices, you might have noticed blood offerings are more acceptable, and they're more powerful, and they're more desirous. Why is Abel's? Because the blood offering, not a grain offering, not a vegetable offering. Why was Isaac's sacrifice asked for by God? It was a blood sacrifice. The lamb on the Passover, it was a blood sacrifice. Blood sacrifices are more desirous of the Lord. When he allows for those cereal offerings and those vegetable offerings, those are for minor infractions, right? Or for peace offerings. What takes away the sins? Blood offerings. Okay? That's what God asks for. They're more acceptable, they're more powerful, because the whole living victim, the whole living animal is being offered. That animal has great value, a lot more value economically even, than just a bag of flour does. And it involves blood. And most importantly, because that's what the Lord wanted. All of these sacrifices offered multiple times are fulfilled in the blood of the victim. We're about to see that in the new covenant. The blood of Christ, the victim, offered on Calvary, replaces the need for any other blood sacrifices. We don't sacrifice bulls and lambs and any of that stuff anymore. We don't have to, because Christ sacrificed his own self as a bloody victim for our sins. Jesus offered it, and why did he offer it? Because that's what the Lord wanted, just as he has always wanted. And that's a once for all to take away all sins as we enter into the covenant with God. So we take our part in all of this. When we obey God's commandments, when we follow Christ's command to eat and drink, that's our participating in that sacrifice, taking our place in the new and eternal covenant. So as we said at the beginning of Torah, when did we start? November? Back in November. Why are we studying Torah? To learn more about our culture. We do, as much as our culture tries to forget it, we still exist in a Judeo-Christian tradition, a Judeo-Christian culture. We did this to understand what God reveals to us, that it's still part of the deposit of faith, even for us as Christians. We didn't throw out 46 books because Jesus came. We did this to see what in the New Testament is hidden in the Old Testament. And so when we hear passages now, we can make that jump and say, okay, this is what that's a sign pointing to this. Like the serpent on the bronze pole, or the bronze serpent on the pole, right? We know what happens, and we can see it being alluded to, being foreshadowed in the Old Testament. To understand the plethora of references to the Old Testament and the New Testament, so many references to Torah in the New Testament. Knowing more about Torah is going to help us understand what St. Paul is trying to say, what Saints Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are trying to say. So that's why we did this. So I hope that those objectives were at some level fulfilled. And I pray that as you continue to study the Scriptures, read the Scriptures, pray with the Scriptures, hear them proclaimed to you at church, that you will find it, that yourself has been enriched, even to some degree, in knowing that Christ is present, even in Torah. And so that will make your faith a little bit stronger here, so it can be stronger here. So I'm going to turn you over to your questions now, your discussion. It is 7:50, so not too bad. I know I went fast, but I really wanted to get that last section in there and still have you have time for questions, or to work on your questions. Okay?